was a time when armed conflict was the domain of warriors and their weapons. But today, civilians, including children, increasingly bear the brunt of conflict, are caught in the crossfire, and are even the direct targets of violence and abuse. Too many children today are living in a world awash with weapons and images of armed violence, turning childhood into an endless nightmare for many. Thousands upon thousands of children are directly involved in conflicts around the world. Some are forced by circumstances to seek revenge, others are driven to join because of poverty and abuse. But the majority are recruited by force or kidnapped. I know this, as I was once a child soldier myself. Children's lives are scarred as they witness events like the violent death of a parent or relative. They are forced to flee their homes and often become separated from their families. Children's daily lives are filled with fear amidst ongoing combat and even more complex threats, as today the nature of conflict has changed dramatically. It can be prolonged by the race for natural resources and involve organized crime. Unknown numbers have been arbitrarily detained and persecuted. Girls in particular are subjected to rape, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, and trafficking.
I went to fetch water, and when I was almost finished, I felt someone come behind me. I saw that it was somebody in military uniform. He took a stone and stuffed it in my mouth and carried me off into the bushes and then raped me.
War violates every right a child has: the right to life, to grow up with a family, to health, to survival and full development, and the right to be protected and nurtured by others. The effect of conflict is real and continues to happen even as I speak to you. I lived through the brutality of this madness in Sierra Leone. Millions of others around the world have seen their childhood disappear as well.
I was carrying food to my brother when I stepped on a mine and lost my leg.
I was with the general, and then because anywhere he goes, I follow. Anything he want me to do, I did.
My house is like a cemetery without any happiness.
The world cannot accept this devastation of children's lives as an inevitable side effect of war. In reality, children have become targets as a result of conscious and deliberate decisions made by adults, and it has to stop. In 1996, the United Nations adopted a landmark report by Michel on the impact of armed conflict on children.
This journey has also given me hope. I have seen how concern for children in these situations can present new opportunities to confront the problems that cause their suffering.
I was privileged to be at the UN on that day, in this very room. A decade later, I stand before you again as part of the review of the progress that has been made, but more importantly, to call on you to commit to the challenges still ahead. Over the past decade, moral outrage has driven lots of progress in the protection of children. Yet there remain many challenges.
The international community has adopted a full body of laws, norms, and frameworks with regard to children in armed conflict. But unfortunately, these are often ignored. What we need is implementation and greater mobilization to end impunity for those who violate children's rights. We need to work for universal compliance. Children's needs need to be prioritized before, during, and after conflict, and they must be incorporated in all peacemaking and peace-building operations. We must ensure special recovery and long-term reintegration programs for children back into their communities. The impact of armed conflict on children exacerbates the problems of poverty, illiteracy, and child mortality. It also prevents the achievement of the world's development goals. We must act now.
Mr. President, We are dying every day. Please help stop the war for the sake of the children.
Every person on the planet has a role of absolute importance to play. So does every government, every religious leader, every member of the United Nations, and every child. Children and young people are not only our future, they should be recognized today as key actors who can participate in finding ways to bring peace to all.
The capacity and resilience of the children should never be underestimated, nor that of their families or communities. I believe in unity amongst people. If we find unity, peace will come and the country will be prosperous. And when there is peace, we can accomplish a lot.
After 2 years in captivity, I see today that education is wealth.
Above all, we must do more to prevent conflict and build peace. But talking is not enough. The youth of the world are ready, but we need all of your contributions. Please do not belittle the importance of your participation in helping us to work toward a world free of conflict and suffering for all children.
Good evening. I'm Elisabeth Lindenmayer. I'm the acting director of the UN Studies program here at SIPA. I also teach a class on Security Council and peacekeeping operation in Africa. And I will be moderating this panel tonight. Thank you very much for coming, so many of you, to celebrate UN Day. It is really wonderful to be here, and I just want to, first of all, to wish you a happy, happy UN Day. They live in violence. They have been adopted. They have lost their homes and those they love. They have been forced and taught to kill, to maim, and sometimes to kill the members of their families. They face rape and exploitation. They have been drugged. They have lost their childhood and their education. The girls are labeled the bush wives, and their babies the rebel babies. They are ostracized. When the conflict is over, they are haunted by their memories. They are burdened by guilt by what they have done. They do not trust anyone. They have lost their humanity. They are child soldiers. They are the silent cost of war, the armed innocents. Why would the United Nations choose a subject like this to celebrate? Why would SIPA choose a subject like this to celebrate UN Day? Because they are children. Because they have no voice. They are overlooked most of the time. Because, as Graça Machel was saying in many of her reports, war violates every right of the child. Because defending the poor, those who have no voice, is the business of the United Nations. This is what we are all about. Because it is a success of the United Nations. It is a success of the Security Council first. It is the story of a Security Council resolution, Resolution 15, I think it's 1612, which is a unique resolution which has set up a mechanism to blame and shame the countries who are taking those children. It is unique in the story of the Security Council, and the members of the panel will explain to you the evolution of this idea. This morning I took students to the Security Council on the issue of women in war and peace, so to speak. And it was interesting to see the members of the Security Council being frustrated about the issue, and some of them trying to put forward a mechanism of the same kind of mechanism which exists for the children in armed conflict. I don't think they are there yet for the women, but it is interesting also to note that this is the only issue which deals with human rights, the only thematic issue of the Security Council for which there is a working group. It is also a success of the United Nations because it is a case where all the parts of the United Nations have worked together. And when this happens, the UN is bigger than its part. When I say that it is a success, I don't mean that everything is over. There are still 250,000 child soldiers, and as we are speaking now, some are being adopted in DRC. They are in Burundi. They are in Côte d'Ivoire. They are in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Uganda, in Chad, in Sudan, in Somalia. They are in Myanmar, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka and the Philippines. And when we say it's a success of the United Nations, who is the United Nations? So let me introduce you our speakers. They will illustrate the point. First, the first United Nations is the United Nations of the member states, the 192 member states. To represent them tonight, we have two ambassadors with us in our panel. We have Ambassador Ripert, who is the permanent representative of France, who is sitting over there. I believe, Ambassador, that you recently arrived in New York, and this is your first visit to SIPA. And I wanted to tell you that the students here can have the dual degree between SIPA and Sciences Po, and I'm sure there are students from Sciences Po in this room. So you are welcome to SIPA, and I hope you will come back many times. Ambassador Ripert is the chairman of the working group that I mentioned to you before on children in armed conflict, and will talk to you about the achievements and the challenges faced by that working group. Ambassador Mahiga from Tanzania is an old friend of SIPA. He's here many times. He was in the Security Council. Tanzania was part of the Security Council when the resolution was passed in July of 2005. But also, even though there are no child soldiers in Tanzania, his country has been enormously helpful in welcoming so many refugees from the Great Lakes, from Burundi, from Rwanda, from DRC. And when he worked for UNHCR, he had a first-hand knowledge about those children and about the issue of demobilization and reinsertion. And he will talk to you about that as well. And then there is the second United Nations, the United Nations of the Secretary General. To represent this United Nations, we have Nicolas Michel, who is the legal counsel of the Secretary General, who is an Under-Secretary General for the Office of Legal Affairs. Special tribunals have been set up on these issues, and the issue of impunity has helped the efforts of the Security Council in threatening to take legal actions against those who are perpetrating those crimes. And I have very much in mind, in particular, the decision of the tribunal on Sierra Leone, the special tribunal who has decided that to abduct children under the age of 15 is a war crime. You probably also know that what we call the Lubanga case is the first case of the ICC, and it is only about child soldiers, and I'm sure that Nicolas Michel will talk more about this. By the way, don't think that this is a French mafia. Nicolas Michel is not from France, he's from Switzerland. I wanted to make this clarification. Hilde Johnson is the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF. She also served as Minister for International Development and was a member of her cabinet in Norway for a number of years. It's very nice to pass resolution in the Security Council. It's very nice to write conventions, but who is going to implement them on the ground? And what difference does it make to those children that we have resolution 16, I cannot remember this, 12, 16, thank you. Well, UNICEF is working on the ground and is really the agency who is dealing with the issue of demobilization and reinsertion. It's a great partner to the first UN that I described, the UN, the political and human rights UN of the Security Council. Tonderai Chikuhwa is the institutional memory of this resolution. He tonight represents the Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict. You probably saw Mrs. Karamaswamy on the tape. She couldn't be here tonight because she's traveling, and Tonderai will represent her. He will tell you the story of the resolution. He worked with Olara Otonu before, who was the special representative before Mrs. Karamaswamy, and he will tell you the story. The third UN is the United Nations of the NGOs. They are extraordinary partners of the UN. They can tell things and do things that the first and the second UN cannot do because it is a political organization. They are there to, as partners, they are there to report about the child soldiers. They are there to push and to complement and reinforce the work of the other United Nations. And as you know, they have been very active with the Security Council. They are behind a number of conventions that we have passed on landmine, about the ICC and so on. All this was pushed by NGOs. Jo Becker is the Advocacy Director of Human Rights Watch. She's also the representative of the Coalition to Stop Child Soldiers in New York. And finally, the first United Nations, the United Nations of the people of the world. It will be represented tonight by Ishmael Beah. I do not think I have to introduce him. Most of you have read his book, the gripping story of his life. His story is bigger than child soldiers. It is about overcoming tragedy, about forgiveness, about accepting one's past, and about having the courage to move on. And I want to acknowledge tonight the presence of his mother in the room, Laura Sims, who has helped him to travel the road.
Rise up. Come on, we need to give you an applause.
I will now give the floor to our speakers, and I would like first to give the floor to Tonderai, who will give us a short brief about the story of this resolution. Tonderai, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for your excellent introduction, and I'm delighted to join this distinguished panel and this very vibrant community at Columbia to discuss this issue. I will take a few minutes, essentially, to give you a sense of the evolution of the children and armed conflict agenda over the past decade. It has been a remarkable development in the UN system, a remarkable partnership between many key entities, member states, NGOs, and various actors within the UN system. And it's been a story of real political will and courage as well to evolve this agenda. One of the key moments in the development of the agenda was the publication or the submission to the General Assembly of a report by Madame Michel of Mozambique and South Africa entitled The Impact of Armed Conflict on Children. And this report, put on the table in 1996, was so deeply disturbing to the international community, to member states and to the UN system, to NGOs, that it led to a number of actions pursuant to recommendations in her report, including the establishment of the Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict to act as an independent moral voice and a leader and focal point for the elaboration of essentially a political project of child protection. It's also appropriate, and this is an aside, that this year marks the 10-year anniversary of the Michel report, and there's been a very intensive exercise ongoing of review of 10 years of progress and essentially developing a platform for continued development of the Children in Armed Conflict agenda. The initial findings and recommendations of that review have been put on the table before the General Assembly at this session, and the report is now publicly available, and I mark that as a reference point for you after this meeting. The establishment of the Office of the Special Representative really initiated what I would call a strategic and purposive initiative to address political dimensions of child protection. Because the international community was and is faced with a very stark dilemma. On the one hand, there are very clear, strong, and comprehensive standards, international norms and standards for the protection of children. And these have been elaborated over the years and become stronger, much more comprehensive, and more universally accepted. But even as we have that good news on the one hand, on the other hand, the actual real life situation for children on the ground has been getting progressively worse. And so in a sense, there was a need for a political project at the highest level to help to bridge the gap between the international standards on one hand and the real life circumstances for children on the other. In some ways, one can put it as for the international community to make good on the paper promises that have been made for children in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol and the plethora of other international instruments. So in order to take the first steps on this, a tactical decision was made. And the tactical imperative was really to try and place this agenda on the very highest discussion table by getting a recognition in the Security Council that the issue of children in armed conflict represents a legitimate peace and security concern, and that children belong at the high table. And the Council, in good faith and with leadership, took this step in 1999 in a formal sense by adopting Resolution 1261 on children in armed conflict. And this resolution, I usually like to call it the Security Council resolution format of the Michel report. Because what that resolution did was paint in the broadest brushstrokes a framework for the protection of children. It set the parameters of a protection framework for children affected by armed conflict by drawing the key substantive elements of the Michel project. So as you read these documents to understand them and analyze them, the starting point is the Michel review leading to a resolution 1261. Since then, the Security Council has adopted 5 resolutions on children in armed conflict. And I don't want to say culminating in resolution 1612, but certainly resolution 1612 adopted in July 2005 represents a very critical moment, and I'll speak briefly to that in a moment. But the implications, really, for you to get a sense of the moment in the Security Council, the implications of the Council adopting the resolution 1261 were massive implications, because that resolution was the first resolution of the Security Council on a thematic human rights concern, and in some ways it shifted the modus operandi of the Council, which deals primarily with country-specific situations, reacting to an unfolding scenario in country-specific scenarios. The implications of the Council putting a resolution on the table on a thematic human rights concern has been that there's been a concern within the membership of the United Nations General Assembly that these thematic resolutions may be used as a backdoor route to get country-specific situations onto the agenda of the Security Council. And this is one of the tensions of the moment. Does the Council take action in a situation like Uganda, in a situation like Colombia, that are not on the country-specific agenda, or does it reserve its action and its engagement for situations that happen to coincide with the country-specific agenda of the Security Council? This is a big tension of the moment, and this tension is not new with 1612. It was set up the moment that the Council took the historic decision to place a thematic human rights concern on its agenda. 1612 is remarkable in the sense that it concretizes the Council's commitment. I would say that it operationalizes the Council's engagement on children and armed conflict. And it does so essentially through three key moments in the resolution. First and foremost, the resolution calls for a process of child protection dialogue with parties to conflict on the ground, both state and non-state parties, leading to concrete time-bound action plans to address the issue primarily of recruitment and use of child soldiers. The second moment of the resolution is the institution of a systematic mechanism to monitor and report grave child rights violations on the basis of a plan of the Secretary General, a monitoring and reporting plan of the Secretary General, which he elaborated in his 5th report to the Security Council on Children and Armed Conflict. The third moment of the 1612 resolution, which operationalizes the Council's engagement, is the establishment of a thematic working group on children and armed conflict. The group that is now, in a practical sense, receiving the information emanating from the monitoring and reporting mechanism and deliberating on the basis of that information and proposing remedial measures, interventions on behalf of children. Ambassador Ripert will speak more to the inner workings and the nuances of the Security Council Working Group. But from a broad perspective, this has revolutionized, in a sense, the capacity of child protection actors to seize the attention of the Security Council. In the past, with the preceding resolutions, there was a rhythm of work, which was an annual rhythm of work. It was a Security Council open debate in response to the Secretary General's report. But after that open debate, in a sense, the Council closes its books on children in armed conflict. The institution of this working group means that the Security Council is working on this issue on a minute-by-minute basis, and it gives the opportunity for child protection actors to seize the attention of the Council on behalf of children at on an as-needs basis. The resolution was a remarkable testament to the political will and energy of the Council, and it was a remarkable technical achievement because it was a resolution 9 months in negotiation with the Security Council experts meeting on a weekly basis for 9 months for the resolution to emerge. The good news, and I close with this, the good news is that all of this infrastructure and all of these bits on pieces of paper, as it were, are beginning to yield flesh, blood, and bone results for children. The resolutions working in tandem with the annual report of the Secretary General and the list in that report are now being used as tools by country teams to open a space for protection dialogue, and we are seeing in places like Côte d'Ivoire and elsewhere that these parties are sitting up, taking notice, and are making real commitments, and we are getting children out of that process. So I will end my comments there and hand over to Ambassador Ripert.
Thank you, Tonderai. I'm sorry to put you under pressure. It's not fair to try to summarize a resolution like this in 7 minutes, but this is the time I have allocated to each speaker so that we keep a lot of time also for answers and questions. Mr. Ambassador, can you take the challenge?
La réponse est non. Merci Elisabeth. Non, je voudrais d'abord en français dire aux étudiants d'abord de Sciences Po bien sûr et ensuite francophones, juste leur montrer que je sais encore parler français bien que je sois déjà ici dans un endroit où on ne parle plus qu'anglais, mais d'autre part leur dire que le plaisir que j'ai à être là et ma disponibilité pour ceux que ça intéresse de nouer des liens avec la mission permanente de la France. Je suis à leur disposition. So, it doesn't count in my 7 minutes. Huh? So I wish, dear Elisabeth, to thank you and Columbia University for giving me this opportunity to explain how the UN Security Council addresses the situation of children affected by armed conflict. It is an honor, and it is an honor to do it in such company with key players in this challenge. I will do it in my capacity of chairman of the working group of the Security Council, because France is chairing this group since 2 years. For 2 years, I'm sorry. I've been working very closely in doing that with the French Minister for Foreign Affairs, Bernard Kouchner, and I'm a close friend of him, and I've worked with him for more than 20 years. I don't need to stress his personal commitment to advancing the human rights agenda in each and every country, in each forum, in each international body. This is why, as soon as he was nominated, appointed Minister for Foreign Affairs, he have asked to be seconded, helped by a junior minister in charge of Foreign Affairs and Human Rights, Mrs. Ramayad. She was there in town a few days ago. She had already made clear that the rights of the child will be on the 4 top priorities on her agenda. And as a first sign of her commitment, Mrs. Ramayad co-chaired with UNICEF on October 1st, alongside with the UN General Assembly and with Mrs. Hilde Johnson, who is there with us, a meeting aimed at promoting the Paris Principle and the Paris commitments to fight against the unlawful recruitment and use of children by armed forces or armed groups, commitments which were made by more than 59 states during the international conference Free Children from War, which was held in Paris in February 2007. So as you can see, France stands at the forefront of efforts to mobilize the international community against the involvement of children in armed conflicts. The United Nations estimate that the number of children soldiers throughout the world still amounts to over 250,000. The situation remains extremely worrying, despite the progress made on normative and political levels in recent years. Current events remind us daily of these tragic facts. I don't come back to it. Elisabeth stressed it, and it will be stressed again by UNICEF. However, and if I were to use the title of Ishmael Beah book, A Long Way Gone, I would say that a long way has gone since the adoption of the Grassa-Marshall report 10 years ago. A long way has gone since, through the milestone report, the United Nations became fully aware of the tragedy, as it was just reminded to us a few minutes ago. First, we have seen the UN Secretary General appointing a special representative for children in armed conflict. Second, this special representative has been publishing year after year a detailed report. In the annexes to this report, Parties to armed conflicts which recruit and use children are named and shamed, it was said already. But last but not least, and it was mentioned, of course, the Security Council adopted in July 2005 the now famous Resolution 1612. It is, this resolution, a small revolution in a way, at least for three reasons. First, the resolution provides us with innovative tools to tackle with the issue. First tool, it was mentioned, a monitoring and reporting mechanism, which is progressively established in each and every of the 12 countries mentioned by the Special Representative report. They are established by the team of the Special Representative together with UNICEF and all other relevant UN agencies or bodies, including, of course, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And these reports provide the Security Council with reliable information on the situation of the children, situation on the ground. Independent sources and reliable information. Second tool, the Security Council Working Group, which I'm chairing currently, whose task is not only to blame and shame, but, and this is much more important, to make concrete recommendations to the Council, Security Council, based on those monitoring and reporting mechanism. Those recommendations can include, and I quote, targeted and graduated measures. Measures is a strong word in the UN universe. It means that we can adopt at the Security Council sanctions, such as a ban on export or supply of small arms, light weapons, the freezing of assets, personal assets, or travel bans. And they are not only words. The Security Council has forwarded to its sanction committee on DRC and on Sudan the names of persons who recruit and use child soldiers. The second reason why this resolution is a small revolution is the fact that although it is not fully recognized as such by some members of the Security Council, human rights and international humanitarian law lie at the heart of the work of the Security Council Working Group. The third and last reason lies in the fact that it allows the Security Council Working Group to work on situations, and it was said, which are not on the day-to-day agenda of the Security Council. In doing so, the Resolution 1612 represents a further recognition of the fact that, in certain cases, serious violations of human rights may constitute a threat to international peace and security. It is, in a way, an application of the responsibility to protect, a principle that was adopted, you know that, at the summit of 2005 by more than 180 chiefs of state and government, which is a decisive step to protect populations, sometimes against their own governments. For France, I don't have to stress how important this was, because you remember that Bernard Kouchner invented 20 years ago the so-called right to interfere, which is, in a way, at the origin of the responsibility to protect that we have today. Does that mechanisms work? Does it have impacts on the ground? Let me just give you a few examples. Côte d'Ivoire. As soon as of August 2005, the UN peacekeeping forces, ONUC, went to the parties to explain the resolution and get them aware that they had been registered on a list under consideration by the Security Council and the Working Group. Therefore, the Force Nouvelle and then all other militias have committed themselves to a dialogue with the task force of the Special Representative and have developed action plans to stop recruitments and use of children. As a result, it has been estimated by the Office of the Special Representative that thousands of children have been demobilized. In her last report dated of August 30th, the Special Representative writes that there is no substantiated evidence of the active recruitment anymore and use of children by armed groups in Ivory Coast. Of course, the signing of the Ouagadougou Agreement in March 2007 also played a very positive role. Chad offers another very positive example. In advance of the consideration by the working group of the situation of children in their countries, the Chadian authorities committed themselves to an agreement with UNICEF to developing action plans to halt recruitment and use of children. In Burundi, the children detained in the cantonment center of Rwanda were released in between the consideration by the Security Council Working Group of the situation in the country and the adoption of the conclusion of the working group. So it had an effect as a deterrent. In Nepal, a few weeks in advance of the consideration of the situation by the working group of the Security Council, an agreement was reached between the UN and the Maoists that no children under the age of 18 will be registered as soldiers during the process of cantonment of the combatants. Of course, despite those positive results, the situation remained dramatic in many conflicts. And this will be my conclusion. In our view, to address the situation, we need more countries to be committed in and out of the Security Council, like the Group of Friends of Resolution 1612, chaired by Canada. We need an energetic special representative, ensuring that information from the ground comes to the working group and that the messages of the working group go down to the parties on the ground. We have the privilege of having with Mrs. Kumaraswamy precisely someone who is in a position, who is willing and who is doing so. We need also dedicated agencies and funds like UNICEF working every day on the ground together with other partners, and we know it's so done by UNICEF, and Hilde will explain that. And finally, we need active NGOs, of course, bringing their own experience, information and approach, talking directly to the member of the Security Council and the member of the working group of the Security Council. And I'm sure that meetings as those ones, not only for the information of the students, will be very helpful in diffusing the information and helping to create the climate in which we will be working more positively in the future. I thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. I wonder if sometimes we can take students to the working group, to attend a meeting of the working group.
I will try that.
I will now give the floor to Nicolas Michel, who will explain to us how the effect of deterrence and the threat of justice can back up the political efforts of the Security Council. Nicolas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. I hope you can see me there, or would you wish me just to stand for, out of respect for the colleagues? It's not that I really need to stand up, but I think out of respect for you. Thank you so very much for inviting me, well, Elisabeth, and for organizing this wonderful event. You know, when you presented me, you kindly tried to avoid well, probably imagining that I was part of what you described as a mafia, but you know, they are very smart. It will not take very long for them to recognize that French is not very different from French, even when spoken by a Swiss. Now, I'm very pleased to be able to participate tonight, not only because I enjoy reconnecting with the academic world once in a while, but also and especially because of the importance of the topic. In keeping with the logic of the lineup and sequence of speakers, I will try to shed some light on the issue from the perspective of the Secretariat and more particularly from a legal point of view. And I would like to place the problem of the recruitment and use of child soldiers in its legal context against the background of the development of a system of international criminal justice and its significance for our shared efforts to combat impunity. Some words about the legal framework first. The prohibition of the recruitment of children below the age of 15, a fundamental element of the protection of children, was for the first time established in the 1977 Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions, Article 4, Paragraph 3c, of which provides that children shall be provided with the care and aid they require, and in particular, and I quote, children who have not attained the age of 15 years shall neither be recruited in the armed forces or groups nor allowed to take part in hostilities. A decade later, the prohibition of the recruitment of children below 15 into armed forces was established in Article 38, Paragraph 3 of the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child. The optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict, adopted in 2000 and entered into force in 2002, detailed the standards against the use of children in armed conflict and raised the minimum age of participation to 18 years. Now, both the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court of 1998, in its Article 8, and the Statute of the Special Court for Sierra Leone of 2000, in its Article 4, criminalize the prohibition of the recruitment of children below 15 and qualify it as a war crime. This legal framework is backed up by a system of international criminal justice that has been significantly developed during the last 2 decades. Today, international responsibility is no longer limited to the classic responsibility of states or international organizations. From now on, it also includes criminal responsibility of individuals that perpetrate the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, as the preamble of the Rome Statute puts it. After the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials 60 years ago, we have been fortunate to see the recent rise of international criminal law and justice. There is now growing international acceptance that impunity for international crimes, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, can no longer be tolerated, and that there will be no sustainable peace without perpetrators being brought to justice. After the creation of the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and within the context of the creation of the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the International Criminal Court has become the centerpiece of a system of international criminal justice. During its relatively short history, the International Criminal Court has already established itself as both the embodiment of and the driving force behind a profound evolution of international culture and law to end impunity. While the use of child soldiers did not form part of crimes listed in the statutes of the 2 international ad hoc tribunals, former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the conscription of child soldiers was a significant part of the charges brought against the defendants before the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The prosecution of this crime will also be highly relevant to the work of the International Criminal Court. Let me just take an example from the jurisprudence of the Special Court from Sierra Leone. In the judgments delivered by the trial chambers in 2 of the trials, the so-called AFRC, Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, and CDF, Civil Defense Forces cases, the accused have been convicted of counts relating to the recruitment of child soldiers. The Special Court for Sierra Leone Appeals Chamber, in a decision on a preliminary motion, even found that child recruitment was criminalized before it was explicitly set out as an international crime in treaty law, thus arguing for its customary law character. Of great importance was also the apprehension and transfer into custody of the Special Court for Sierra Leone of Charles Taylor, the first African former head of states to face criminal charges at the international level. The amended 11-count indictment accuses Charles Taylor of being at the heart of a joint criminal enterprise resulting in the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international humanitarian law, including the use of child soldiers. The crime of conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15 years into the national armed forces or using them to participate actively in hostilities, as the Rome Statute puts it, also plays an important part in cases currently pending before the International Criminal Court. The ICC prosecutors' investigations into the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo led to the indictment and arrest of two individuals, Thomas Lubanga and Germain Katanga. The conscription and use of child soldiers are major parts in the indictments for both. These crimes also play a major role in the ICC indictments issued in the northern Uganda cases against the leaders of the Lord's Resistance Army. Let me conclude and say that the system of international criminal justice that I have just outlined contributes significantly to bringing an end to impunity and to establishing a culture of accountability. It already has deterring effect on potential perpetrators of such crimes. While I am very pleased about how far we have come, I cannot conceal that major challenges still lie ahead of us, such as ensuring the enforcement of pending arrest warrants, or how to best achieve and maintain peace without compromising on or sacrificing justice. Perhaps within the 7 minutes I should stop here and leave these and other questions for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Students of my former classes will remember the subject that I gave them for a paper, Should Justice Precede Peace? Or Should Peace Precede Justice? And we are right in the issue. We have heard the Security Council, we have heard the issue of justice. How does it translate on the ground? What difference does it make to the children, to their lives and their reinsertion? We will now ask Hilde Johnson to talk to us about the work of UNICEF. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think I prefer to stand because I like to see people's faces who I'm speaking to. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for focusing on this important subject for UN Day. Let me take you to Gulu. Some of you might know this is in northern Uganda, a small town used to house the Lord's Resistance Army. Teresa, I choose to call her. She was only 16 when I met her there, a few years back. She told me her story with dark, depressed eyes, traumatized. At 12, she was abducted by the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, and was forced not only to use a gun and to use it against her own community, but also to work as a servant and a sex slave for the commander of the Lord's Resistance Army, Joseph Kony. She managed to escape after several attempts, pregnant. When I met her, she was close to birth. At 16, at least if you looked at her eyes, she was already an old woman. I hope that one day she will laugh again and that the smile will reach her eyes. I have met many like Teresa. As minister, UNICEF people meet them in many, many countries. That is why we are here. That is why we have these mechanisms put in place in the UN system at the national level to try to dissuade leaders of armed groups to recruit children, to affect them in this way. That is why we need to ensure that those who do it, despite all these efforts, are brought to justice and held accountable for their acts. And that is why UNICEF not only supports these efforts, excuse me, we are doing our best in the field, not only to support, but also to help the victims, help the communities, the families, and the children that are affected. So who are these children? Who are they? Firstly, there are many. Elisabeth, in the introduction, said around 250,000. Actually, we don't really know exactly the figure because it's really difficult to map out. Many dark numbers. Secondly, they are both girls and boys. They're not only a boy with an AK-47 we see at 12 on the TV pictures. This is also a girl's issue. In Sri Lanka and Colombia, for example, girls represent up to 40% of the children enrolled. And we can imagine the most important job they have. ... They are abused sexually. Thirdly, they can be as young as 7 or 8 years old, as we have seen in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Even if they are in majority, they are in their mid to late teens. Fourthly, they joined armed groups or forces for many different reasons. In some cases, they are abducted, such as in northern Uganda, or forcibly recruited, like in Sri Lanka. In other cases, they joined armed groups simply because there is no other alternative. No schooling, no livelihood. There is only war. Or they join because they actually need protection. And surrounded by a world of violence, they see protection in a gun. That's the only thing that can provide them with a protection against others' guns. They often escape an abusive situation at home. They may also seek justice for the murder of parents or siblings in countries where law and order are simply not of circumstance. They perform a very wide range of tasks in these situations. They carry loads, clean, cook, care for injured. They also, of course, fight, clear mines, bring ammunition to the front lines. They guard and even execute prisoners. They can be used as sex slaves, and in most cases they perform a number of these tasks simultaneously, and usually without any salary or compensation. Understanding who they are and what led them to this situation is key to efficient response, and it is key to prevent this from happening. So what are we actually doing? We're doing two things broadly. The first important thing is advocacy and dialogue. And this is actually linked to the Security Council Resolution 1612. It is to start by convincing governments and armed groups to actually not recruit, and when they do, to have a dialogue about stopping the recruitment. In the cases of governments, it's to adopt the most protective legal framework possible, means ratifying the optional protocol you just heard about on the rights of the child in the involvement of children in armed conflict, and if possible to set a minimum age of 18 for all recruitment. And we also call on them, and this is UNICEF and the UN bodies, to establish a legal system which will treat these children primarily as victims rather than perpetrators themselves. We have a number of allies in this work when we do advocacy and dialogue, and they are both the special representative, whose representative is here with us, but also NGOs, as the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, and Human Rights Watch is one of them with us today. Preventing child recruitment also means working with governments at central and decentralized levels and with communities. We do that. Unfortunately, these efforts are rarely sufficient because when conflict erupts, children are almost always used to some degree. And our work then changes in nature. And this is the dialogue we then enter into with leaders of armed groups, government forces, to obtain the immediate and unconditional release of all children they hold. For this, we of course use the threats of criminal and political accountability that you just heard about. Without those threats, it's much more difficult for us to succeed. We try to obtain the release of the children as soon as possible because each day means additional exposure to the danger and more difficulty to reintegrate the children. So the case of Ivory Coast that the French ambassador just referred to is a case of success so far. We have succeeded in the dialogue. The Security Council resolution has worked. The Special Representative's dialogue with them and UNICEF's dialogue with them has worked, and we have helped reintegrate, demobilize and reintegrate. Which brings me to the second area of work. So advocacy and dialogue, and the second area of work for UNICEF then is to help the children, assist children on the ground. Together with government partners, NGOs, we then design demobilization reintegration programs to facilitate the return of children to their communities. How do we do that? Firstly, they need to be inclusive, which means we assist as many vulnerable children as possible, and we cannot exclude those coming out of armed groups. This is both fair and essential for true reintegration. We also need to avoid that these families of these children are selected so that there is tension in the community between those being reached with help and those not getting anything. So secondly, we design programs for the communities. The communities, because we need to address and understand the difficulties the whole community faces in caring for all their children. For example, we would rather rebuild the village school than just helping one child that came out of war and is demobilized to have schooling, tuition, support, for example. So this approach also reduces stigma, which is a very difficult challenge in these environments where the child soldier has a stamp on his head and comes back and can be discriminated. So the community approach is the right one. Thirdly, we have programs that adapt to address the specific needs and fears and aspirations of children, which means that we need to have dialogue with each child about when they are released, about how we can understand the circumstances of each child, what led him or her to this situation, and in many cases establish contact, often through our work or NGOs' work, and contact with the family before they return to try to facilitate the return as much as possible. And this is particularly important for girl mothers who are very easily stigmatized when they return. Finally, programs should be adapted to the socioeconomic environment there locally. Of course, this is a challenge. As in post-conflict societies, these opportunities are extremely poor. In Liberia, UNICEF, together with ILO, conducted a labor market study to try to find ways and means of helping young people with vulnerable backgrounds such as this to be trained and to find alternative livelihoods and ways of income. For these types of interventions, we do have detailed guidelines on prevention and reintegration programs through the Paris principles as referred to by the ambassador. 66 countries have signed up to the Paris principles. They're extremely important for us in actually broadening the ownership of implementation on the ground, of really helping children in the right way. Without the Paris principles, we would have much less structure and standards in how we do this work. It's key for the children. And if there is really one thing that experience has taught us, it is that there is no lost generation. Although Teresa looks like an old woman when I meet her, it is possible to get out of trauma if you get the right help. And it is possible to get out of such a situation and have a new and different life. But it is dependent on the international community's ability to assist and on the local community's ability to be receptive and supportive. And I think we have one very good example here, and you'll hear more from Ishmael Beah, who is a person who can show that this is correct. Finally, just to sum up in 4 short, brief points. The violations of children's rights, which is our mandate in UNICEF, during conflicts take very many different and equally odious forms. That is why we need to focus on the individual child, and we need to actually make that child have a better future. Secondly, although children unfortunately play a central role during most conflicts, we tend to forget them at times of peace. The protection and care of children needs to be a central element also in peace agreements and in their implementation. So Often the attention to children fade as soon as peace agreements have been reached. That should not happen. And finally, we can do our best to protect children in war. And we have done so. 30,000 demobilized in DRC, 6,230 in Sri Lanka. I can go on and on. This is all a result of UNICEF and partners' work. We can do that. But nothing will replace protecting children from war. No war is neutral on the lives of children. All wars lead to violations of children's rights. And it is therefore on preventing war that governments and the civil society should concentrate more of their efforts. It is with preventing war that children will be protected, first and foremost. That should be our first task. If we don't succeed in that, our next task is to put children at the front of the agenda. And we do have mechanisms to do so. We have to make it happen to them in the reality of their lives, on the ground, in the field, where it matters, so that they can feel the presence of us. Thank you.
This is a very undisciplined panel. I don't think any member has respected the 7 minutes rule. So I wonder if our two last panelists could do that and only address the points which have not been covered. Because I know that all of you want to listen to Ishmael, and this is why I asked him to speak last, because I knew that he would steal the show, and you would not listen about at Security Council resolution and legal niceties. So may I ask Ambassador Mahiga and Joe Becker to be as short as they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for inviting me. I'll try to be as short as I can. I want to share my experience with you from 3 different perspectives. The first one is the manifestation of the child soldier problem, which I witnessed in my previous incarnation as a humanitarian worker representing the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Liberia at the beginning of the 1990s. Secondly, my experience in the Security Council representing Tanzania and in negotiating the Resolution 1612 and seeing the consequences of it. And thirdly, out of the Security Council, as a member of the United Nations, seeing at how this resolution is being implemented by nation states. From 1992 to 1994, I was the representative of UNHCR in Liberia. I saw firsthand a country that was generating refugees to neighboring countries, but at the same time receiving refugees mainly from Sierra Leone. The country was divided by 3 main warlords and fighting factions, the biggest being that led by Charles Taylor, the second by Ulimo, and the third was the transitional government in Monrovia, and there was a splinter group in the eastern part of the country. Charles Taylor tried several times to occupy Monrovia, and this was my first experience to see a whole brigade of children under 15 making an attempt to capture Monrovia. The children had 3 main functions. One was to spy for the main fighting force. Second was to be sacrificed to clear landmines. And thirdly was to fight, because they could infiltrate the swamps around Monrovia, which had overgrown grass, but being small, they could be undetected by the ECOMOG forces of West Africa, which were defending Monrovia. It was a killing field. It was a massacre. The bombardment by the ECOMOG forces, this was a cannon fodder. And at the end of it, you could see bodies of littered children between the ages of 9 and 12, maximum 15. I was disturbed. These were the time when the The Convention on the Rights of the Children had just been adopted, and I didn't know what should be done at this. While in Monrovia, my second experience was in relationship to the displaced persons and refugees in Liberia. One fine morning, I was awakened by ECOMOG forces, and they said the IDPs, who they called refugees, they said, your refugees have been killed. This was close to the Firestone plantations, which grow rubber for an American company, which is now, I think, a Japanese company. I went there and found dead bodies of over 500 persons. Most of them were women and children and old people. I asked, were there no young people? They said Charles Taylor had attacked the displaced camp in order to recruit young people, and they were taken by force. Indeed, we could see the trail of young people who were resisting that had been shot from the back as they were being dragged to be taken into the army of Charles Taylor. My other experience was with the fighting children of another armed group in northern Liberia, where there were also Sierra Leonean refugees. There was a whole battalion of young children under the command of Salt and Pepper, a young boy of about 17 years controlling around about 800 children. They'd come to a refugee camp and forced the drivers of newly acquired trucks for UNHCR to be taken. They were full of food and taken into the bush. At that time, the United Nations representative was Mr. Ross Mountain. He gave me a helicopter and said, Augustine, you have to go and negotiate to get back your trucks. They dropped me at the middle of nowhere and I had to go and negotiate. Salt and Pepper had been wounded and was being guarded by these young people. And I realized that basically these are children. When I approached and I spoke to him, of course, I told him, Mr. General, I've come to talk to you. I want my trucks. He said, I'll give you your trucks. Leave the food, but also please take letters to my mother and father, who I think have fled across the country to Guinea or Ivory Coast. I don't know where they are. Secondly, Mr. Mahiga, I want to go to school. If you can get me a school, when you get back to Monrovia, I drop this gun and come to Monrovia to go to school. I knew I was talking to children. So this is the fate of the children of the child soldiers. And talking of a battalion or a brigade is not less than 5,000. I was told Charles Taylor had more than 5 brigades of child soldiers. That is the magnitude. At that time, the international community had no instruments in place. Little did I know that I would become ambassador to the United Nations for Tanzania after working for UNHCR for 11 years. My government called me back, and within a year, Tanzania was voted to go to the Security Council. I am proud to say, under the leadership of Jean-Marc de la Sablier, we were able to negotiate Resolution 1612. I don't want to tell you the merits because it has already been elaborated. But it is important that the United Nations is not only a standard setter of protection and normative principles, particularly for children, as we have done for refugees or for women, but this particular resolution is so significant because it will recognize the importance of children being excluded from warfare as a matter of international peace and security. While in the Security Council, there was a debate on which country should be on the agenda. Is it only those that are on the agenda of the Security Council, or even those countries that are not on the agenda, but they're child soldiers? It was a heated debate. But if you look at the report of the Secretary General, there is Annex 1 and Annex 2, and all these countries where the problem exists have been covered. While in the Security Council, I had a much more important experience of demobilization and the disarmament of child child soldiers. The point between what Hilde has just said, when they are taken for reinsertion, when you have a peace agreement, you have the peacekeepers, and then you have to separate these children from the combatants. It is an urgent process. You have to separate them from the other combatants. They may be from different armed groups. They need special care. They need quick action. They are girls and boys, but sometimes that process takes such a long time. It goes up to 8 months, 9 months or so. It is very serious. For lack of resources, it can drag on. I'm saying this is very important, that as part of the security sector reform, the separation of children must be a top priority. I also experienced that there are children who cross boundaries running away from the battlefields and going as refugees. We recognize them immediately as a prima facie refugees. And certainly there are also other complications, and we have the Cape Town principles on the modalities of disarming these children. I hope you are looking at those and see what kind of action needs to be taken. Finally, out of the Security Council, but still at the United Nations, I'm looking at how nation states are implementing Resolution 1612. There are complications. Many countries are just emerging from conflict. It is a challenge to peace building, which was one of the resolutions that I had the happy responsibility of negotiating at the United Nations. Peace building has to address these issues. But above all, it's not only the question of the Security Council, security sector reform and the addressing of ex-combatants who are children, but there has also to be legislation in these countries, whether they have the problem of refugee, of child soldiers or not, but you need to put in place legislation that will prohibit once and for all the recruitment of children. It is a mark of our civilization, and I think we have made considerable steps at the beginning of the 21st century, that among the benchmarks and yardsticks of our civilized world is this resolution on children and armed conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this very moving account of your experience. Joe, you have nearly the last word.
It's got to be the worst position. You've heard 6 speakers already, and you still haven't gotten to Ishmael. It's really remarkable to think that only a dozen years ago, the issue of child soldiers was barely a blip on the international radar. There were no international courts that could prosecute child recruiters, and it was still legal under international law to take a child as young as 15 and to send them into combat. These dramatic changes have certainly been a collaborative effort of all of the actors that you've heard here tonight. From an NGO perspective, our role has been to try and do our best to highlight the issue, make it more visible, to push governments and other key actors to make changes, and to hold governments accountable for the commitments that they make. We often work collaboratively with UN agencies and with sympathetic governments like those of France and Tanzania. And in other times, our job is to make governments very uncomfortable and publicly challenge their positions and hopefully embarrass them. Human Rights Watch conducts research and advocacy on human rights violations in about 70 countries worldwide. We began working on the issue of child soldiers in 1994 when we sent our first team of investigators to Liberia. They gathered the testimonies of dozens of children who had been recruited into fighting forces, and we published our first report on the issue with recommendations to the actors for what needed to happen. And since then, we've published at least 20 other reports on the use of child soldiers in countries like Colombia, Uganda, Chad, Sri Lanka, and Burma. Our reports have helped to influence rebel groups in Liberia to adopt new policies against the use of child soldiers. They've helped to pressure the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka to reduce the number of children they use in their forces. and helped persuade the government of Burma to create a high-level committee to address the issue of underage recruitment. We often find that it's most effective to join forces and to work together and pool our collective strength. 10 years ago, governments were negotiating the optional protocol that would raise the age of participation in armed conflict to 18, as you heard Nicolas describe. But because of political positions and obstructionist governments, these negotiations had basically come to a standstill. And so NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Save the Children, and others, we joined together and we formed the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers as a way to try and mobilize political will and public attention to this issue to try and make change. We formed national coalitions in dozens of countries to lobby individual governments. We organized regional conferences all around the world to bring governments, the UN, and NGOs together to mobilize action. And in 2000, we succeeded in getting the UN to adopt this new treaty. And today, there are nearly 120 governments worldwide that have ratified it. We also work very closely with the Security Council, and we very much appreciate the leadership that's been provided by the French government. We try and provide information and input on issues that we think can make a difference. For example, we often tell Security Council members that they have to be willing to use their most powerful tool, sanctions, against the perpetrators who continue to violate international laws by recruiting and using child soldiers. We say that these governments and armed groups can't continue year after year after year to use children in their forces without some form of negative consequences. One example is that next month, the working group is going to meet for the first time to consider the situation in Myanmar, or Burma. And Burma's been in the news lately because of the vicious crackdown by the military government against peaceful protesters last year. But in fact, those military that were used to crack down on those protesters include significant numbers of children. And the government of Myanmar is one of the worst violators in the world when it comes to the use and recruitment of children. We know that Burma has powerful allies on the Security Council, and it's going to be a very difficult task to try and get consensus among the members to impose sanctions. Next week, Human Rights Watch will be releasing a new report based on a 3-month investigation that we've conducted that documents the way that the government has continued to rely on children to fill its recruitment quotas and to fill its ranks. And we hope that our findings will help the Security Council understand the full scale and scope of this problem and take the action that's going to be needed. Compliance with international law, though, is clearly still a huge problem. There are many governments that will sign up to international law and then go ahead and recruit children anyway. And so finally, I want to say that NGOs also try to look creatively for other strategies to try and reinforce UN standards. For example, in our research, we found that of the 20 countries worldwide where child soldiers are being used, in 9 of them, governments are involved, either by recruiting children directly into their own forces or by supporting militias or paramilitaries that use children. Now, of these 9 governments, 8 of them are currently receiving some form of military assistance from the United States government. And so a group of NGOs decided that the US could use its leverage to try and enforce international norms. And we worked with members of Congress in Washington to put together a bill that's currently pending that would cut off US military assistance to governments that don't comply with international law. We think that for many governments, if they, signing a piece of paper is one thing, but if they realize that keeping children in their forces is going to put their M16s, their fighter jets, and military financing at risk, maybe they'll be willing to take the issue more seriously. Now finally, as an NGO, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask for your help and tell you what you can do. This bill that's in Congress, it's called the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, and it's really gained a remarkable amount of support. In the Senate, almost a third of the senators have already become co-sponsors of this bill, including everyone from conservative Republicans to liberal Democrats. But surprisingly, Senators Clinton and Schumer have still not signed on. So as folks living in New York, even if you don't come from New York, what you can do in the next couple of days is call those offices and ask them to show their commitment to this issue as well by co-sponsoring this bill. Thanks very much.
We have described to you the institution, the system, what the United Nations as a whole has done. Let's listen to Ishmael to see if this has worked. Ishmael, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I almost feel as if I have a very difficult task at this point in time to follow up what everyone has said. But I will do my best, and I'll keep it short as well, because I think at this point, I think probably a lot of questions are in your head and you want to ask them. So I'd rather have more of a discussion than talk at you. But there are a few things I would like to add to what has been said in terms of resolutions, legal standards, international criminal law that has been developed to combat the use of children in war, and advocacy work that has been done through Human Rights Watch and other organizations, the implementation of these things, the outcomes through the mobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs in different countries. And also, you know, somebody mentioned a little bit about peace and justice, what that means on the ground. Now, how do all of these things translate on the ground? What does it do for the people who are affected by these things? I think it's what I am going to talk about. I would not talk so much about what has been done at the United Nations. But I will highlight the fact that I think oftentimes when people get together, either in the Security Council or discussions like this to try and find ways to talk about this problem, perhaps people despair sometimes, thinking that this is a waste of time and that there are more pressing things to be done, which is that people should just take action. But if action is taken without a clear thought of what should be done, it can actually be more devastating than actually waiting and actually trying to figure out what it is to do. Now, for somebody who comes from this experience, some of you might be wondering, why would you say that? Waiting requires a lot of people to die. But sometimes if you go in without knowing what you're doing, people will die even more. But what okay. Is that good enough? All right, very good. Maybe I should start over again? No, I would. Just joking. Ask the colleagues next to you. They will fill you in on what they've just heard. What I'm saying is that the importance of these things on the ground. I think the United Nations, I think it's a very important organization. First of all, it is a place that allows us to be able to have this discussion. It is a place that facilitates thinking about this issue. If there wasn't such a place, we would not even be able to discuss this issue at all, and try to find ways to actually help people who are affected by it. Now, I've seen a lot of people who talk badly about the United Nations, that it's useless, it's not functioning, it's not doing this and that. I think that is very sort of a mediocre argument, because first of all, because of the United Nations, we are able to learn statistics about certain parts of the world. We're able to organizations have come out of it, UNICEF and other NGOs that do remarkable work that help people who otherwise would not get any help at all. How many people in this room, if it wasn't for the United Nations, you wouldn't have heard about Sierra Leone or other places at all, or even places that these wars are going on. So the dissemination of information to the public that is not directly affected is very important, to raise that awareness and to show that there are people that have been affected elsewhere. Now, another aspect of these things, all these things that have been discussed, resolutions, advocacy work, implementation, is that it gives, I believe, it gives courage to people who go on the ground and try to do work. What gives that strength and courage to the average UN worker, UNICEF worker, Human Rights Watch, to go into a place like Sierra Leone when there was a war there, to a place like Sri Lanka and try to go and talk to a warlord, to a commander, and try to ask for children to be released, try to set rehabilitation centers and move people to action. what motivates them is because there's a resolution, there's an international legal standards that says this is unacceptable. That gives courage for people to go and be able to dialogue with people. If there wasn't such a thing, people wouldn't go because they will be killed. And even if people who go sometimes are killed, but they continue to go because this law continues to develop. Now, I don't think I am going to go that far to say that the program has been very, very successful. There have been a few successes, but I think there's more that needs to be done. In celebrating the United Nations, I think it's important to talk about the successes, but more importantly, to talk about what hasn't been done and how it can be done. I think it's very important for me. Celebrations are a moment of reflection to what we haven't done and how we can change it, rather than talking about what we have done that hasn't worked, in my opinion, to a large extent. For example, the use of children continue, which is why I think it's really fitting to have this topic particularly discussed on the celebration of the UN Day. And when people go on the ground also from the UN, all this advocacy work, this research that gets done from outside of these realities, I think it is very important also for people to have an understanding of the cultural implications of these places that they are going. And throughout the years, I think people have come to see that. For some people, the concept of justice is different from the Western perception of it. I grew up in Sierra Leone where the idea of justice is not a punitive measure, it's a rehabilitative measure. That was part of the culture before the war. Now if a punitive measure comes in play immediately, a lot of people, it would not help the culture at all. Now I'm not making an excuse that people who are the big fish, those people responsible for really bringing about this problem should go free. But I'm saying you cannot prosecute everyone in a country that is emerging from war, because first of all, you don't have the resources. And if you do have the resources, I'd rather have them go to victims, people who have been affected, to rebuilding the nation, rather than trying to punish everyone who had anything to do with these wars. So there are those kinds of things that happen there. And also one thing that I want to really stress is that trying to fix this problem of children affected by war, it's a fairly new thing in the international scene. So obviously mistakes will be made. People will learn as they go along. No one has any idea how to deal with children who have been subjected to extreme violence. It takes a lot of work, commitment, long-term commitment to be able to do something concrete. And a lot of mistakes will be made. For example, a lot of people are of the opinion that if you remove children from the context of war, they will be fine. They won't be fine. It requires time and commitment. Children do not heal very quickly, as some movies would have you believe. In my opinion, it took me, my personal experience, it took me about 8 months to be able to recover, at least to set foot on the path of recovery. Now, if somebody had thought in the first 2 months that it was impossible, that I would never heal, I wouldn't be standing in front of you. So what I'm also saying to you is this: there is no unifying, there's no one method that works and others don't work. There is no formula that can be generalized in any way, because from conflict to conflict it differs, and also from child to child it differs. The way each person is traumatized is different, and therefore they require help in a different way. And so you cannot generalize these things at all. And another thing that I want to highlight also is that one of the successes that I think has been done, lots have been done, but one of the successes that I'm very happy about too, actually, is that this discussion continues to be in the mindset of the international public, which I think is absolutely important, because this problem persists. And as we let it continue, it becomes more complicated to solve. So more thinking needs to be put into it. So I'm glad that this discussion continues. The second and most important one is that I think because of this discussion through the United Nations and other aspects, academic fields and things like that, one of the things that I'm very happy about is that the definition of a child soldier has been expanded to cover a whole range of things that were in the perception of when people thought of child soldiers thought of. I think to this day, a lot of people still think the child soldier is the boy with the AK-47, as you always see. But that is not all. There are girls, as you've heard before,
But not only that, there are children who don't participate directly, but because of the wars, their lives come to an end. They lose families, they are orphans. And after peace treaties are signed, they don't have anywhere to go, they have no families. Those are also victims of war. So for me, I like using the words children affected by war rather than child soldiers, because I think it gives a holistic picture of the problem. And also what happens, the reason why I'm stressing this, what happens is that when even peacekeepers that are not educated enough about the situation go into these countries afterwards and try to place children into rehabilitation programs, sometimes they don't understand that that definition is broader. So they only go after the child who visibly has the gun and no other person to be able to access this program. That is also a problem. In Sierra Leone particularly, we had, we are almost a test case for most of these things where a lot of mistakes were made. But now I think a lot of progress has been made as well. But in the international scene, to be able to get a political will, to be able to move countries to act, it's very slow and often frustrating process. But things get done slowly. We wish they could get done a bit faster because I think a lot of talk has been done, particularly in the United Nations, and more action needs to happen. I think we have a lot of ideas of what to do, but the next phase is to really implement them, go on the ground, and make sure that we do certain things. Now, I see it as two strands. First of all, there is several strands, actually, maybe three. I should highlight three. There's the international legal and criminal standards of it in trying to hold certain people accountable and trying to actually repair certain international criminal laws in these nations that have broken down their institutions, the rule of law, and things like that. And the other part is to try to find ways to actually help the children that have already been affected. And the last one, which is very important but often forgotten, is to actually find ways, I think a lot of people pointed that, but this is very important, alongside with all of this talk and all of this new and innovative ways to shame governments, to be able to prevent the sale of small arms into these countries and to be able to do so and so forth, is to actually find ways to prevent the root causes of these wars. Early prevention. Because once wars occur, children will be used. That's just the natural progression of it. Because they are the ones that will be separated from families, homes, and communities. And they are, in most of these countries, they are the larger part of the population, and they will be sought after to participate in these wars. So, I think more needs to be done on the preventive side, which is people need to think about ways to actually prevent these wars, which sometimes can happen with very little resources if people are willing to pay attention to it before it shocks humanity. I think the pattern of the international community is that no one is willing to do that. It's not politically popular to prevent things before they actually shock humanity. And I believe that is one of the problems. Over history, we've seen that if we don't do that, the problems get to a point where it's not so easy to solve. For example, in Sierra Leone, the war came to an end almost overnight when the UK decided to go in and do something finally. Now there are other things that were in place. The ECOMOG was there beforehand and the UN troops were there. But they basically went overnight. And now everyone was applauding Tony Blair about what he did. And rightly so, he did good. But my question was, what stopped him from not taking that action early on? If this war could be prevented so quickly in such a short time, shows, first of all, that humanitarian action can work if it's done in the interest of the people. And also, if it's done earlier, it could prevent lives. When he went to Sierra Leone with the British troops, about 800 men, it was at the height of the war where everyone thought it had gotten so out of hand that it was unsolvable. And he was able to stop it. Now, imagine if he had done that earlier on, it would have saved a lot of lives and probably used less resources to do so. So that's something that I want people to keep in mind. And more importantly also, I think, I think a lot of times a lot of people belittle their contribution towards fixing whatever problem that befalls the world that we are currently living in. I think the alternative, which is if all of us decide that our contribution would not do anything, that the problems are so big and so hopeless that we can't do anything, our inaction actually will cause more, the alternative is worse. So I want people to be able to never belittle what their contribution is, whatever little it is. But lastly, I think what I will say before I really end this is that the use of children in war should be every country's problem for this particular reason. This is not a threat. I think this is a fact. If we ignore this problem, we are going to have countries that will have leaders that will be these children that we're ignoring. If we don't do anything about them now, we will have to deal with bigger problems later on. These children will grow up to assume positions in their own countries, and there will be people who don't have any moral or ethical standard at all because they haven't been helped. And they will assume position, and they will have to deal with the children of other places that have ignored this problem, and we will have bigger problems at hand. So I think it's in everyone's best interest to really do that. And more importantly, children, if they are helped, as we know it's possible now to do so with the right care and support, we have some of us coming from this war have had a first-hand experience of what war is, what the nature of violence is, and what it does to the human spirit. I think that contribution, that knowledge, it's very, very vital to the fate of our world that we're living in. I think I'll leave it at that so that we can engage more in a discussion. Thank you.
We will now take questions. The students who want to ask questions should come to the microphone, should introduce themselves and possibly say whom they want to ask the question to. So please. You can go in a line and take your turn. One question should be short, shouldn't be a statement, but a question. Thank you. Please.
My name is Agnes Umuna. I'm from Liberia, and I'm so happy being here today. I'm here on the trauma studies dealing with war survivors of the war. And my question is to the UN people. You know, I deal with war survivors. I don't like to call them perpetrators. I like to call them war survivors. What are the UN doing about the DDR disarmament and demobilization in Liberia? I really want, because it's a whole complicating thing. I deal with ex-combatants and children, especially the young boys and the girls. So it's a complicating thing in Liberia. What is the UN going to do about the disarmament program in Liberia?
Just very quickly, from the UNICEF side, I at least know that in Liberia we have demobilized and reintegrated up to 11,780 children. That was the 2005 figures. We're continuing to help the children to be reintegrated with our development programs. But we do not, as we don't have the mandate for children, relate to or help the grown-ups, the adults that have also been war affected. So there is other programs for them. I don't know the details of that since that is not UNICEF's main responsibility. But we do have a major program in Liberia that has also been successful for these children. Thank you.
Tonderai, you want to add something?
I would just
answers should be as brief as the questions. Thank you.
I would just add to that it's very important to see the different dimensions of the DDR programs for children. It's not only about the intervention for the kids themselves and the process of healing for them, but the circumstances of many of these conflicts are such that there has to be a process also of healing for communities to enable them to reabsorb their children. And this makes programs for DDR a much more complicated affair. It also makes it a much more elastic affair in terms of the time needed for a successful program to be carried out. So I urge you to think about the dimensions of this, not only from the child's perspective, but the healing that has to happen in communities to reabsorb children.
Just wanted to say one thing. The DDRR is, of course, one of the programs that peacekeeping operations have in their peace-building mandate. It's daunting. You know, ex-combatants will not give their weapons if there is no peace. So it's linked to the peace process. It's linked to the security reform of the country itself, which has to reabsorb these people. They will not give their weapons if there is no job. And how do you create jobs in a country which is sometimes a failed state and, you know, has very little prospect? So Liberia has a daunting task here to try to create jobs for these young people who have been demobilized, who were children, and who probably will take the weapons again if they cannot find a way to make a living. So this is a very, very difficult question that you have asked. Yes, second question.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthew Sandy. I'm doing MPA at SIPA. I'm doing program in economic policy management. I'm from Sierra Leone, and Ishmael is my brother. I'm happy for him and for what the UN has done. My question actually is going to be directed at the table. Anyone could answer. It's actually related to what you have actually mentioned, and based on what you've spoken, it's clear that we need more than an end to the abuse of children, but we need an end to the cause or to the root of the problem. And to me, what I believe is, I've served in my country for 5 years as budget analyst, and I know what it means to be an analyst in a poor country. You want to do something as government, but you actually don't have the fiscal space.
What is your question?
My question is, what is the UN going to do, not just to go indirectly in terms of assisting these countries, but to actually go directly, maybe in collaboration with other multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, that actually go directly to actually assist these countries to address issues of economic management. That is because that is very, very important in terms of addressing the root of cause. Thank you.
If I may, just an element of answer. In the reform of 2005, we have created something which is very important in my view, because it's very creative, which is called the Peace Building Commission. And it's precisely aimed at trying to tackle with the roots of the crisis as soon as possible within the crisis, so that the exit strategy, as we say in the jargon of the UN, takes into account all aspects of the situation, and precisely working on what was the roots, what were the roots of the conflict, to try to make some prevention work. And as you know very well, Sierra Leone is one of the 2 countries which has been chosen to test the ability of the UN to reform itself and have everybody working together, all the institutions of the UN and civil society, NGOs, whoever wishes to join, and the neighboring states. So it's really the start of the process. It has only 1 year old. The chairman of the Sierra Leone group is just coming back from your country because of the election. The situation was there, and we are trying to build a strategic plan.
Including the World Bank and the IMF.
Including the one, yeah.
I hope we answered your question. And, you know, the answer is also that peace building was orphaned before and didn't have a home. And this Peace Building Commission is putting all the actors together, including the bank, the IMF, and everybody else. Peacekeeping, peacemaking, everybody is in it. So perhaps there can be a strategy to put this Humpty Dumpty back together again. Question.
My name is Nsozi Kakembo. I'm a student, master's student in urban planning. I'm from Uganda. And my question is regarding how and when does the UN choose to supersede traditional measures of reconciliation with their more punitive measures? And where do you draw the line between respecting these communities' traditions with their own measures and mechanisms that the UN has in place for their punitive measures?
Thank you very much. I mean, I have to be very short, but I know that you're addressing an extremely sensitive and delicate issue. But just, I mean, thinking of what you are alluding to, I would like to recall that in that specific case, the case was referred to the International Criminal Court by the country itself and not by the United Nations. And I think that the International Criminal Court was established on the basis of the principle of subsidiarity, meaning that it is in the first place for each and every country to put in place efficient judicial mechanisms to address these issues. It's only in situations where the countries are not willing or not able to prosecute themselves that cases can be referred to the International Criminal Court. Now, it is true that in the context of the negotiation of the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the relationship between reconciliation and criminal justice was not very well established, and this is clearly an issue that needs to be better addressed, except that I really do think that for at least the people most bearing the greatest responsibility for the most atrocious crimes, there is a need for a criminal prosecution. For others, I understand that mechanisms for peace and reconciliation can also be respected, or either put in place or respected, like in Rwanda with gachachas and others. So I really do think that these processes should duly be taken into account because they are very valid. And to address them in the reconciliation in communities at the local level, most of the time it's the only available mechanism. But this shouldn't prevent, international courts to functions. Not necessarily only international courts, also so-called hybrid, I cannot be too long, I'm sorry, but hybrid courts that are put in place by virtue of bilateral agreements between the UN and specific countries. So I would very much recognize your point, while also emphasizing the need for criminal justice for the greatest criminals.
Yes, Ishmael.
I think, in addition to that, I think there should be a sort of, I don't think international standards or certain things that are coming from outside should not supersede certain cultural elements, and vice versa. I think there needs to be a collaboration, a common ground for something that works. Because either way, there are disadvantages and advantages. For example, one of the reasons that people used to justify the use of children is that they say culturally, in our culture, when people are 15, they're already a man. People can use that to recruit children. So there's a slippery slope if you give priority to one side. So I think there should be a way to just be able to find a compromise between the two laws, but in a way that functions for the benefit of the country, rather than for the benefit of making the international community feel as if it's administered justice in any way.
This is such an important point and difficult to answer, as you know, because justice is seen by different countries in a very different way. And we at the United Nations feel it when we work with 192 countries. And there is something wrong. The way people perceive the notion of guilt and the notion of punishment is completely different according to all the nationalities we are working with. So it is an extremely delicate question. Next question.
Hi, my name is Geraldine. I worked a lot with girls. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
No.
My name is Geraldine. I worked a lot with girls who are coming from Côte d'Ivoire because I was working in Burkina Faso, and one of the things that that occurred a lot is a lot of girls who are coming back from the war, who are war victims, but they were affected by AIDS. And I was wondering what kind of how you're addressing it, the AIDS crisis, especially with the girls who are coming from these countries, and they're also bringing the AIDS problem into Burkina Faso, Mali, and the surrounding countries. So what is the UNICEF is doing about that, and other NGOs related to?
Yeah, this is a critical question, and it happens actually in quite a number of these countries, that girls that have been both subject to rape during conflict, plus have been sexual slaves and used and misused in a war like this, that they are HIV positive coming out and being reintegrated into the communities. In such cases, I mean, what we do, not only UNICEF, because this is a collective responsibility by all, the government concerned, plus those that are active in the health sector in terms of donors, including then UNICEF. Our responsibility is to try to provide both additional protection for these girls, but also to provide ARV, which is the treatment that we use to prevent HIV from developing into AIDS. And thirdly, try to help them with what we call PTMCT, which is preventing mother-to-child transmission, so that the children that they are, for example, if they're pregnant, that they will not then, given treatment, be transmitting the disease to their children. So we do have programs where we look at this in a holistic way, and we try to help the girls so that this doesn't develop into AIDS and that they are able to handle the HIV situation. The challenge, on the other hand, is about reaching out to adolescents all over in the country, because HIV does actually increase in times of war and conflict, and there's a major challenge in reaching out with large-scale campaigns to adolescents and also the provision of condoms in these situations. So it's a major challenge, not least also with the presence of troops and with including, actually, unfortunately, peacekeepers. So there are major challenges linked to HIV and AIDS and spreading under conflict. And it is a collective responsibility for us in the UN system and for all other actors to actually address this and try to prevent it from becoming worse.
Thank you.
Good evening. I want to thank the panelists for this evening. It's nice to hear from the policy side of things. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question on behalf of the practitioners. My name is Ryan Nichols. I worked with the UN mission in Liberia in 2004-2005 with the DDR unit, and I'm currently working with the UN mission in Sudan, in southern Sudan, with the DDR unit. Just came back a couple days ago, and I'm on a little break. The problem that we're having here, as always, is the gulf between policy and practice on the ground.
Speak up.
Sorry. I'll do this, maybe. The problem that we're having, as always, is the gulf between policy and practice. I'll address this question to Ms. Johnson, as always, from UNICEF. The problem that we're having is that the children, as you mentioned, are being treated with a community approach. So, DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, the DD can be done in a day, okay? You take away their gun, you can stamp them out of the army, no problem, they're gone. Reintegration is very much the backbone to a successful DDR, which, as my colleague from Liberia was suggesting, is still a mess in Liberia, partly because the reintegration was a problem. And one of the reasons it was a problem is because of the lack of reintegration of the child soldiers. And the same problem is happening in Sudan, partly because of the community approach. You can't, we're here talking about child soldiers, and yet from a UNICEF perspective, there is no individual support given to child soldiers. It is a community approach where you go and refurbish a school where it is hoped that many of these children will go back to, and that they will receive this benefit through these means. This is not working. I understand that it's because we don't want to stigmatize children, but they're already stigmatized anyway, and for the most part, all of their friends and family are former fighters anyway. So you have the 18, 19-year-olds who are getting benefits from the DDR program, and the 17-year-olds and under who are getting pulled out, saying, sorry, just go back to your community, we're gonna provide some new books to your school, and that should help you out, and best of luck. The question in a nutshell is basically, what are we doing while this policy level debate push is happening and moving forward, which is good? What are we doing to take a look concretely at what's happening on the ground and to reevaluate policies if necessary?
I'm afraid you are on again, Hilde.
Where were you in South Sudan, by the way?
I'm currently in Malakal.
Or in Malakal?
Yeah.
Okay. This is one of my passions in South Sudan, so you're lucky who's there. I think what your question does is illustrate the complexity of the challenge, because the dilemma we have in the field is the following. If we are to integrate child soldiers on a non-community-based approach for those below 17, we will have to have a presence in almost every village around. The only other alternative we have is to have them on boarding schools. Now, UNICEF hasn't only had the community-based approach. I was previously minister, as you heard, in Norway, and I visited the earlier UNICEF programs of demobilized and not yet reintegrated children that were on a boarding school in the surroundings of Rumbek.
actually a pretty successful program. And as far as I understand and know from that program, they had education over a long period of time and was also able to receive trauma therapy so that they were able to be reintegrated in a better way after that. But we can't keep the children on boarding schools or on those specific types of programs for too long, delinking them from the community. At the same time, UNICEF does not. We would love to have the capacity to have UNICEF staff in every village in South Sudan, but that isn't possible because of our resources. We have, as you are well aware, I'm sure, limited staff and limited resources. So I think the challenge in a way is that we don't have a perfect solution for these children. So for those that are elder, this part of the formal DDR program, that's easier because they're also in a different situation. The younger ones, we do have semi-solutions. But having the possibility to be present, to follow them all the time, is a challenge for us for resource reasons. And it would also very easily create tension in the community, because we would then give more attention to these children. And you say they're stigmatized anyway, which is true. But the dilemma is that you would create increased tension between those served and those that are not served with the same services. And I'm looking at Ambassador Mahiga here, who knows very well from the Tanzanian side the tensions between the support for refugees from Burundi in Tanzania in the communities that are bordering on the refugee camps. That has been an incredible tension because they see that all the assistance comes to the refugees whilst the communities are left in disarray, which is one of the reasons why Tanzania has had major difficulties in handling the Burundi refugee issue. Being very generous for a long time they have, but I mean it is a very difficult challenge. And this is what happens in communities with poverty. So I don't have a perfect solution to this. If UNICEF did have, much more resources, we would be able to at least have more centers, sub-regional centers in the different states, looking at where we could have, more of a transitional approach and maybe keeping them for a longer stretch before we reintegrate them entirely at the village level. But at the moment, this is not on the table for us for resource reasons and capacity reasons. But I thank you for asking the question because it shows that the reality on the ground is difficult, it is complex, and there is no perfect solutions. We just have to navigate between semi-perfect solutions and maybe compromises with what we have on the table.
Main perpetrators of recruiting and forcing child soldiers. And I believe
I think you have asked Ambassador Mahiga.
Yeah, because his experience in, as you mentioned.
I think dealing with non-state actors is one of the biggest challenges to humanitarian workers. For example, the ICRC, the International Red Cross, has developed a way of reaching out to non-state actors. In my experience, we couldn't venture out to go and talk to the non-state actors unless we were escorted by ECOMO or Global. But the ICRC humanitarian workers refused any kind of military assistance. And they had a very good rapport with some of these non-state actors. It is really the skills, courage, and determination of the humanitarian actors who can reach out and even negotiate corridors to non-state actors. But also the extent to which a culture of observing certain norms and ethical standards spread out or filter out to these non-state actors. When we were in the bush, one of the strongest means was to have a radio and listen to BBC or French Radio International. And when these non-state actors were cited, named, and shamed, they were very sensitive. I told you the example of the Firestone incident where people were killed. With me, there was a journalist from the Netherlands who gave an interview immediately after we visited Firestone. And she said, while I was there, I was with a UNHCR representative. And then, 2 months later, the United Nations sent an investigation team to find out who exactly did that. And one of the members in the team was somebody I had gone to school with, who is the Attorney General of Kenya. Then I traveled to Banga for a totally different reason, to see Charles Taylor. I wanted transit to go to the refugees. He kept me waiting for 2 days, then he received me. And he said, Dr. Mahiga, you have to tell me why you told BBC that I killed those people. This could be the end of your life today in the next 5 minutes. I said, Mr. Charles Taylor, are you sure it was me who spoke to BBC? He said, yes, if it's not you, but you were there when that woman cited me as killing those people. Then I said, by the way, the United Nations had sent a team to investigate, so really there is no pronouncement as yet. And one of those members in the team is a classmate at the University of Dar es Salaam. He said, can you tell him a good word for me? So he was mindful of this. Really, I don't want to go into details how I was able to escape that afternoon with my life and jumped on the UN helicopter to go back to Monrovia, but it was scary. But one thing, I negotiated and wriggled out of Banga, but he was very conscious of what the international community was talking about them. So somehow, these principles, these norms do reach out to these people, and the radio is a most powerful way of reaching out. But I agree with you, it's difficult. And I want to express my respects to many humanitarian workers who have braved some of the most threatening odds to reach out, and you have to talk to these rebels in various parts of the world. But somehow it will pick up.
Joe?
Just wanted to add a word. I think the ambassador is absolutely right that many of these non-state actors actually care quite a lot about their international reputation and are vulnerable to pressure to comply with international norms. But a second element is that many of these non-state actors, they're receiving military and financial support from outside sources. And so part of our challenge is to identify where they're receiving their support and see if we can use that as a point of leverage. And just 2 examples, the Tamil Tigers from Sri Lanka have used thousands of children as part of their forces. They receive significant amounts of money from Tamils who are living in Europe and Canada and other Western countries. A couple of years ago, the European Union put a travel ban on the leadership of the Tamil Tigers, and that prevented them from traveling to Geneva, to Paris, to London to carry out their fundraising campaigns. And so that actually, was a pretty big impediment for them. And then secondly, another example is the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. For years it was receiving arms and military assistance from the government of Sudan. And so there was some concerted efforts to try and persuade the government of Sudan to use its influence with the LRA and to cut off that source of support. So it's definitely more difficult with non-state actors, but it's certainly not impossible. There are ways to influence them.
We will take the last question.
I'm Jeannie Annan. I'm a psychologist and a researcher at NYU Program for Survivors of Torture, so not a student. Tonight a pretty stark picture was painted of child soldiers. Hilde, sorry, speak louder. My question is especially for UNICEF and Human Rights Watch, that a picture was painted of child soldiers as particularly traumatized and dark and not without hope, but I've been working in northern Uganda for about 8 years now, and the other side of the picture that I see is strong, resilient. I think the picture that Ishmael paints, but that he's not, and he has different opportunities, but not an exception in many ways. That child soldiers are very resilient and strong. Many in northern Uganda accepted by their families and by their communities warmly. My question is how you face this dilemma of painting the horrors of war and how much these child soldiers are victims, and yet taking into account the resilience and strength that they have, both in programs but also in publications, and the picture that people have of these children and the agency that they do have, and balancing that picture, which I think is really important.
Joe, you want to address that?
That's a really good point, and it is a real dilemma for an organization like Human Rights Watch, where we're trying in many cases to shock people with the information that we gather about how stark and how difficult the situation is, and oftentimes the testimonies that we gather are really quite shocking. And we want those victims to be able to have a voice in the international arena, and we try and provide a platform for those voices to come forward. But at the same time, you're right. It's a fine line between bringing forward the shocking aspect of the problem and leading people to conclude that this is an impossible situation or that these children are lost forever. And so that's why I think it's so important that people like Ishmael are speaking out and able to show what's possible with assistance. The other thing is, when we conduct our investigations, we often, when we're talking with former child soldiers, we'll ask them, what are your hopes for the future? What do you see for your future? And they'll talk about going back to school, and they'll talk about wanting to become doctors or teachers. And we try and include that testimony in our reports to say there is a future, there is something beyond being a child soldier.
I will just try to take this opportunity to...
Elisabeth?
Yes?
I would like to answer that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hilde,
may.
sure. Didn't see you.
No, I think we have to make a clear distinction between advocacy at the global macro level and programming, how we do it at the micro level, meeting each child. And it's not like UNICEF paints a bad picture globally, which we bring to the child and say, you'll never get over this. No, we say, you will get over this. And we try to help them get over it with their programming. And I fully agree with the person who asked the question that there's lots of resilience and lots of also very, very strong children that are able to handle it. But we cannot paint a picture that isn't also taking the side of the victims that have suffered the most and actually make that part of our advocacy. I would not like to paint a rosy picture internationally, because that wouldn't be real either. So I think we need to distinguish between the advocacy job we have to do to get the support to make the changes happen that we need to have happen in the global systems that we just talked about. Because if we don't do that, we won't get the perpetrators be dealt with, and we won't get program results either in the countries that are affected. So that will adversely impact children. So I would make that distinction, and then I would agree with you on how we deal with the children and helping them actually be not the lost generation, which was one of my main points. They're not the lost generation. They will get over it. They can be able to get over it. Thank you.
Ishmael?
I think for me this is very important, because I believe that it is important. There are several realities here. First of all, children who are touched by these wars see really bad things, and I think it will be kind of pointless if you talk about their experiences without really pointing out what happened to them and how they can get out of it. Now, what is important is that there's a context to this, and I think oftentimes when it's done without any context, like it's sensationalized on media sometimes, that's where the problem comes. Then they begin to look as if they can never heal again, that they've just been violent all their lives and nothing. So for me, particularly writing the book, that was the struggle. How do I give people a strong sense of the violence, which is what it was? Show them how cultures, communities, people disintegrate because of this violence that comes into their life, and how they come out of it as well. I think people need to see all those things. As long as there's a context given to it, I think that's it is acceptable in my opinion. But also, more importantly, I think it is very important for people not to push children who are not willing to do so, because not everyone who has reached that point in their life that they are willing to share their story or they are willing to be able to stand behind it. So I think there should be some sort of sensitivity, which I think has been for a lot of NGOs, to speak about certain children without naming them or without putting their face on something. And I think that is also very important for people to know that, because for some people, not talking about it, it's a healing process for them. For others, talking about it actually is a process for them to heal and to be heard as well. Because many times when you find yourself in this position, you feel forgotten by the world. So for a lot of children, it's actually a way to talk to the world about what it is that they're going through. So it's not either or in a lot of ways.
I thought it was the last question, but there is a last one.
Elisabeth. My name is Solange, but I'm not French, as Elisabeth was saying. Anyway, I wrote this down before Ambassador Mahiga made his last statement, and I think this discussion is great, but my suggestion is, why don't we have it on, you mentioned BBC, why don't we have it on what's the word? PBS or CUNY here, Channel 1, Channel 43 or others. They do that sometimes during the weekend, because this is the way to have your words heard, and that's what you want. Almost everybody else said that. And you mentioned the word actors. How about having movie stars, actors, also speak for you? And like George Clooney is doing that, Angelina Jolie is doing that, etc. I can go on, but thank you so much. It was one of the best discussions I ever heard.
I just want, before we conclude, to tell you that the United Nations has a lot of ambassadors for peace, and we use a lot of actors to help us in our work. You may know Audrey Hepburn was one. UNICEF has some. Various agencies have various ambassadors for peace. So this is a means which we use very often. I just wanted to tell you, since we are talking about children moving on, and I want to finish with a message of hope and not a message of despair tonight. I wanted to attract your attention to a child soldier who is now in New York. He was not 18 when he came last year. There was an article about him in the New York Times in May 2007. He's from Côte d'Ivoire. His name is Salifou Yankebe. He was not rehabilitated in a UNICEF camp. He was, first of all, he was a child when his father was murdered. His sister was also murdered. His mother tried to prevent. He went to an IDP camp and for 2 years, and he was still very young. And during that period of time, rebels came from the north and tried to take him and his younger brother. His mother tried to prevent the rebels from taking his younger brother, and they chopped his hand. He was abducted himself and was in a camp for a number of years, and suddenly he arrived in New York last year, practically from the rebel camp to New York, was put in prison. He was seeking asylum and obviously was not legally in the United States, was put in prison, was only out of prison 4 months ago, knowing no one, has no resources. And I just wanted to tell you that he wants to have a trade. He wants to rebuild his life, go to school. He needs money. He has nothing. He would like, in the very warm and rich tradition of African culture, to tell his story with a movie. He would like to go to a movie school. He needs your help. And there will be a box outside if you want to give something to help him. There is also the story of his life, the New York Times article that we have put on the table for him, for you, and also an appeal case that we wrote. So please help Salifou Yankebe. Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers for coming tonight. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest, and keep it alive. Good night.